All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be doing Stormdancer, Book 1 of the Lotus War by Jay Kristoff. I'm going to start off a little differently, and we're going to do a little summary of this book. So, Stormdancer is focused around a girl named Yukiko who lives in this Japanese esque steampunk dystopian world. It's very much like smoggy and like there's a lot of like pollution and stuff like that based on the steampunk technology that's used. So there is like most of it is still focused around sword fighting technically. But like a lot of the swords are basically chainsaw blades, and there is like magic and stuff within this world as well. So Yukiko specifically has this power to be able to speak with animals. She can kind of like mentally connect with them and like understand them. And there's other elements to that, but that gets explored later in the books. I don't want to go into too much detail, but essentially we follow her journey as she works for this kind of spoiled, rich shogun who her family is kind of sworn to. And she ends up, dealing with that. There's like these cool mythical beasts that are dealt within the books and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of magic. I would say it's more focused on, like, the magic is definitely part of it, but there's like kind of like a magic versus technology-esque feel to it. It's very environmentalist. I'm gonna go into a few non-spoiler things that I think are good about the book and some things that aren't. So, the concept of the world and the world building itself, I would say, is pretty good. There's not a whole lot of there's a lot of world building done by Jay Kristoff, and you can tell sometimes it's, especially towards the beginning of the book, it's a little slow, but it's definitely well done. There's just a lot. There is a main entity beyond the shogun and his rule. There's like an entity within his rule, but also kind of outside of it, called the Lotus Guild, who is kind of the makers and holders of all this steampunk technology, and they have a lot of different things they've kind of got their fingers in. I would say they're pretty well done, and they're both cool and terrifying at the same time, and I really like that about it. I think Yukiko is a pretty decent main character to follow. We'll get into some critiques, but when female characters are written by male authors, sometimes they come off very flat, especially as a main character. But I think that I enjoyed following her story and what happened, like how she dealt with the situations she was put into. And she lives in this very dangerous world that kind of threatens her from all these different angles, which is good for conflict. And it's not like the conflict isn't always I'm going to die. Sometimes there's other elements that she wants that are in conflict with other people. And I really appreciate that, because a lot of times, I think this was his first book, and a lot of times, like first books especially, a lot of the threat is put in just direct violence. And since characters don't really die frequently, especially in a first book, and especially main characters in a first book, that death, like death by combat threat, especially when you're doing fights over and over and over again, is very much lessened, and it's not very compelling. But this, it felt like the stakes were good, and like there were clear things that she wanted, that she was fighting for. Yoritomo, who is the shogun, is, I personally enjoyed him. Like I liked to hate him, which I think is good for an antagonist like him. He's definitely gives off the spoil rich kid vibes, that he's always gotten whatever he wants, so he's gonna take whatever he wants. So I think, like, and with him having all this power and stuff like that, it makes him feel very untouchable, and his character definitely portrays that. So I really like that. There wasn't any sometimes, like, with antagonists like this, they'll be like I'm secretly doing this for X, Y reasons that are like my main motivator. But with him, it's just like, nah, he's just selfish, and it makes sense with how he was raised. All right, let's go into some non-spoiler critiques. So I'm gonna start off with Yukiko is a teenager. She's like 15, 16, I think, in this book. There's a few over-sexualizations of her character. Not a big fan of that. I think that this... there's one thing I'll talk about in spoiler discussion in a little bit. But there's a couple times where I'm like, maybe she should have been aged up, or these scenes should have been cut. I think that it's not like, you don't always need these, and you don't need to over sexualize her, especially when she has so many more other interesting qualities. I don't think she needs to be like this sexual icon character. So the perspective in this book, especially in the beginning, is kind of weird. It is in third person, but it's in this weird mix of like closed third and omniscient third, where we are like sometimes in a character's head, but sometimes not in a character's head, and it bounces around a lot. And sometimes we just switch characters without really knowing we've switched characters. We just jump. That might be partially because I'm listening to it, so there might be page breaks and stuff like that that would be in the book that would give a hint towards that. But I thought it was a little poorly done. Perspective, like doing perspective well really makes it a lot easier on the reader to keep up what's going on. I don't think it's like a huge downside. I think it ends up being okay, especially as it gets further and further into the book. But it's definitely not standard. It's a little weird, and it sometimes can take you out a little bit. So I would, no, we'll talk about that in the spoilers. A big thing I do want to talk about in this, and it actually made me pretty hesitant to actually review this book, but I'd already read it and I wanted to talk about it. So here we are. So Jay Kristoff is a white guy, and I'm a white guy reviewing a book written by a white guy based on Japanese culture. So I'm basically reading as an outsider with the perspective of an outsider. And there's a lot of heat on this book because of that. And I definitely get that. With this book specifically, it's very, very heavily reliant on that. Like, he directly rips off like Japanese mythology and their culture, and it's like, as someone who reads a ton of fantasy and likes to write fantasy, I think that is not the best way to do it. I don't think he's malicious in doing it. I don't think he's trying to, you know, like, there's definitely a clear appreciation of the culture, but you're still an outsider. And from some of the other reviews I've read and listened to by people who are, well, I know at least some of them are from the culture, he made mistakes, a lot of mistakes. And you're going to do that. So I think that's just not the best way to go, especially when it's like literally like they're like, you're literally taking their culture as an outside and using it for your own story. I think there's a way to in fantasy, I would say that the best way to do it more, and the way I prefer, is to design your own culture, but take pieces, elements, like learn how cultures form and develop, and use that to influence your culture of your world. But taking directly from a culture is a little, I would say, not okay. And that, I think, for justified reason, I think that is a huge criticism of this book. And I think that it definitely needs to be stated in every review. I personally still thought the writing wise itself, not separating it from this, the writing itself, I would say, is relatively good. It's not the greatest thing I've ever read, but it's definitely not the worst. I would say it's better than not. I've read some stuff that's real bad, but that still is always in the back of my mind while I'm reading this. And I would love to hear about this from, you know, someone who like is actually has that cultural experience, because I think that could very easily make it where they couldn't even read this book. So, that being said, I think this is an okay book. I might try some of other, like, I'm finishing this series out because there's very few series that I won't finish out. And so we'll talk about the other books. I'll probably bring this up in every review about them. But there's definitely a very nuanced conversation that needs to be had about this specific topic. Not sure I'm the best person to have that conversation, but here we are. And if people want to talk about it, we can talk about it in the comments. Okay, we're going to go into some spoiler stuff now. So if you don't want any spoilers, leave the video now. Okay. So, I'm just gonna, most of my pros for it are non-spoiler. I do like the twist at the end with her father, Yukiko's father, being a yokai kin as well, and him being able to have the same powers as she has. I thought that was an interesting twist. I kind of wish there was a little bit more setup for it, but I liked it. There are a few criticisms though, that I want to get into that are spoilers, quote. Going back to Yukiko's sexualization, I think most of the relationships in the book with Hiro and with Kin were okay. Because Hiro is a younger man as well, and I think that with them having a consensual relationship, it didn't kind of make me cringe. Kind of wish she was still a little bit older, like 18 plus, but it wasn't the end of the world, and it's not like things were overly described to the point of me being like, I'm uncomfortable. One scene that I think should have been cut, and I understand the purpose of the scene as a plot point, which is basically there's a scene later in the book where Yukiko is in the bath with Kage rebels who are like fighting against the government, and two younger boys are peeping on her. And there's enough description that I'm like, this is not okay. And these boys are like 12. And like, come on. Like, we really don't need this here. But the point of it is to show off her tattoo and show that she has the Imperial Sun tattoo, that she's working for the Shogun. But she's not anymore. I think there are plenty of other ways that could have been done without putting her in a compromising position like that. I think it could have easily been done as like a show us your tattoo because we need to know if we can trust you, and her being able to do it herself, versus this scene, which is like, I think that's definitely a scene that needs to be removed. Now, it's too late, obviously, because the book's published, but it's something that I'm not totally okay with. Last critique, spoiler critique. I think the concluding fight is pretty boring. I think a lot of the stuff leading up to it and the aftermath of it are really great. But the fight with Yoritomo and Yukiko and her father, and they kind of like mental attack him, and he just dies, when I don't think that was really well set up prior, was very like out of left field. I think that if it had been set up throughout the book and she had used it to get out of other situations, I think that I would have been more okay with that scene. Like if it would have been like a hint that it was coming, but I felt like there were not enough hints to make it feel like, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, definitely. So I felt like that was a little bit of a cheesy way to get out of a situation that was pretty difficult. I feel like there also could have been other ways that she could have gotten out of that situation, but I kind of get the point of it. But yeah. We'll see what I think of the rest of the series. Again, cannot stress enough. There's a conversation, and I feel much more equipped to handle the conversation of the book on its own merits, but that conversation can never be had without talking about the culture that is used in this book as well. It's always going to be tied together, and it's going to have to be brought up every time I talk about this book. But I'm interested to see what other people think. I read a lot of reviews. I did a lot of research into the controversy in this. I'm not part of the culture, clearly. I don't think, as far as some of the criticism about it, I get it. I don't know if it's, I don't think it was done for malicious reasons, but it's this very like fine line that I think Jay Kristoff crossed over. I think he went way too far taking from the culture and should have instead developed and designed his own culture, maybe inspired by Japanese culture, but not directly Japanese culture. I think it would have been really good to have like maybe a sensitivity reader for this type of book before it was published, because I think a lot of those criticisms could have been handled prior to the book being published. But I think that's going to be it for this one, guys. I went really long on this review, but I think there's a lot to talk about, and definitely a very difficult conversation to be had with this book in particular. So if you've read the book, if you've liked it or not liked it, if you agree or disagree with what I say, post in the comments down below. Let's talk about it. I'm really interested to hear differing opinions on it. As always, if you do like the videos that I put out, please leave a like. Super helpful. And be sure to subscribe. I'm really appreciative of all of you who have subscribed so far. It's awesome to see, and I hope we can keep growing the channel together. So that's going to be it. So thanks for watching.